A very warm welcome to all of our watchers and listeners this evening. I'm absolutely delighted that you could all join us on this important day. My name is Eilish Angelini. I have the great privilege of being the principal of St Hugh's College. We're so pleased to be joined this evening by so many of our alumni, students, friends and colleagues from around the planet on this particular day, International Women's Day. We're also particularly pleased as we launch the college's celebrations to mark 100 years of Oxford Women. That's the 100 years when women were able to obtain a degree. Although women were allowed to obviously attend from an earlier period, they were not allowed to have a degree at the conclusion of that until 1920. And some 34 years later, it was before the first women could collect their degree in the Sheldonian Theatre. The St Hugh's that so many of you have known and come to love, I hope, is still a vibrant co-educational college which still retains a sense of its radical roots and indeed its traditions, and of course our firm commitment to diversity. Over the coming months, we are looking forward to celebrating the incredible careers and contributions of so many of our former women students through special events and online projects. And I really hope that you'll be able to get involved and support us in those endeavours. This evening, it gives me the greatest pleasure to be able to introduce our distinguished guest, Rebecca Funt. Rebecca read English at St Hugh's, matriculating in 1982, and was recently elected an honorary fellow by the governing body. I think it's fair to say that St Hugh's can claim some very small credit for kickstarting Rebecca's stellar career as a celebrated BAFTA award-winning actress. Rebecca became involved in comedy while studying at the college, performing her first comedies in college in a sketch show co-written with her brother Jeremy, also a very successful writer and producer. During her time at Oxford, she became the first female president of the Oxford Review, the university's renowned and distinguished comedy society here at Oxford. Rebecca is, of course, known for her fabulous performances in numerous comedies, including The Thick of It, The Day to Day, Knowing Me, Knowing You with Alan Partridge, Big Train, Nighty Night, The Other One, and Avenue 5, as well as many dramatic roles in Lewis, Death Comes to Pemberley, The Eichmann Show, Humans, War and Peace, Queers, and Poldark. She's also appeared in many feature films, such as The Aeronauts, Down a Dark Hall, and Transformers: The Last Night, as well as Repression, which she co-starred in with Uma Thurman. She starred in innumerable, and has in fact still stars in innumerable radio shows, including Incredible Woman, Shush, which she co-wrote, and Jack and Millie. As if that wasn't enough, Rebecca is also the author of 2 books, Impossible Things Before Breakfast and Curious True Stories and Loose Connections, a collection of autobiographical stories which was shortlisted for the National Book Award Non-Fiction Book of the Year. Before we get to speak to Rebecca, as I mentioned earlier, was delighted that governing body elected Rebecca as an honorary fellow, but not just for her incredible contribution to the British entertainment and film industry, but also for her charity work to raise awareness about mental health. She has worked with several charities over the years and is currently a patron of Anxiety UK. She's also an ambassador for Together for Short Lives and the deafblind charity Sense. It's a huge privilege to have you here this evening, Rebecca, and a very warm welcome to St Hugh.
Thank you so much.
I wish, Rebecca, that you were actually here so that we could have a glass of wine together, but in the spirit of that togetherness, I have my glass of wine ready, and I hope you do, all our watchers this evening and our audience are able to relax. This is the interview of the night. I know that there's some other interview on at 9 o'clock this evening, but I can't remember what it's about.
Well, we all know what they say anyway, so there's no point watching that one.
That's true. To kick it off this evening, our conversation, can you tell us, Rebecca, a little about your time at Oxford, if you can, and what was it like at St Hugh's in the early 80s?
St Hugh's was, of course, all female when I was there, and it had an air of a sort of old-fashioned girls' boarding school, which I really loved, actually, because when I was growing up, I used to read things like Mallory Towers endlessly, and I always felt I'd slightly missed out on going to an old-fashioned girls' boarding school, and suddenly there I was in one. And my abiding memory of St Hugh's, apart from the beautiful garden and the lovely architecture and that fabulous library, which I really loved, is of, and I hope this isn't true today, but maybe it is of a smell of boiled cabbage. You would walk in, presumably the kitchens were quite near the entrance. So you'd walk in and there was always there was that lovely Wedgwood blue and the smell of boiled cabbage. And you'd sort of think, okay, I'm back at school. It always just had that slightly sort of, yeah, just kind of old fashioned, but I absolutely loved it. I had the time of my life there.
Great. Oh, no, it's all kimchi and all exotica that we do now, not just ordinary cabbage. And but you talk about being here in your book, Curious, and you, in fact, at some point, I think you had rather unconventional accommodation here in the college.
Well, my first 2 years I lived in college. The first year, in fact, I had a room probably quite near your office, I think. You would come into the main building, turn right, go up to the first floor, and then go along towards the gardens. And my room was one of the ones overlooking the gardens. So I thought I was incredibly privileged. What I didn't know was there was some kind of plant growing up the outside which attracted flies. So I used to keep my window open, and then I'd literally go out of the room to the bathroom, come back in, and it would be full of flies. So I spent quite a lot, and I'm a bit Buddhist about trying not to kill things. So I would spend a lot of time teetering on chairs trying to get rid of flies. And then, yes, then I lived in, I think, the Wolfson building. I can't quite remember.
What
And
was
then,
the state of the art in your day?
sorry?
What was the state of the art in your
Oh,
day?
it was all very modern and lovely. I really loved that one. Nice big room. And then I moved out for my final year and lived above a bridal shop on the Cowley Road. It was sort of above a bridal wear shop and opposite a sex shop.
All right.
And about as dingy a flat as it's possible to imagine. And what we didn't know, and I think this is probably what you're alluding to, because I've mentioned it in my book, is that, I mean, it was a building that should have been condemned and has indeed now been knocked down. But we used to go through this alleyway to the flat. We did this every day for probably 2 terms. And then our doorbell kept ringing. And this strange man kept ringing the doorbell and saying, asking for some bloke who didn't live there. What we later discovered was, in fact, there was a lean-to shed at the end of this horrible derelict passageway. And there was a man living in it. And we had no idea. We'd been living there for the best part of a year. And there was this guy, we think he may have maybe just come out of prison, didn't have anywhere else to go. It was fine. He hadn't bothered us. We didn't bother him. It was just kind of weird to realize that this guy had literally been living in a shed at the end of the garden.
Really spooky.
Yeah. Poor guy.
But you when you came up to St Hugh's, it was to study English. At what point in your childhood or your teenage years did you decide that English was the thing, and what was it about the subject that really attracted you?
Both my parents love literature, and my mum had done a teacher training, the equivalent of a degree really in teacher training, and specialised in English, and she always loved particularly the romantics, and also drama. So she got me inspired to read things like Keats and Shelley, and I got sort of really into those. But more pertinently, she said to me that when she was younger, she used to like borrowing plays from the library and reading those. So I used to go to the library on my way home from school and bring them back and read them with my mum. And that sort of got me into both kinds of into drama, which obviously became my career, but also into reading and my love of literature. So it was very much a house full of books, and we were always reading and always sort of discussing stuff we were reading.
At what point did acting become an attraction to you, or something which you thought about as a career?
I was very young, actually. I mean, I think I was probably 6 or 7. And I don't really know. I remember doing a little thing at infant school or primary school, an assembly, and playing some kind of silly part in it, and absolutely loving that. Really loving people's eyes following me, and all the things that actually off stage completely would freak me out. But on stage, I loved that control of being able to make people laugh and make people listen.
Mhm.
And also my dad is quite a sort of, is a natural entertainer. You know, he's a singer, and he's very funny. And I do remember sitting in a room at a big family party and watching my dad telling a story, being brilliantly funny. And again, thinking, I kind of want that. I want that. I want to have that effect. I want people to watch, and I want to be able to, you know, make them laugh.
Mhm.
And I think, like most actors, almost every actor I've met, I'm actually quite shy. So the way to do all of those things was to pretend to be somebody else.
Mm. And when you came to Oxford, how long was it before you joined the Oxford Review?
Well, I remember joining Ouds on Freshers' Fair.
Mhm.
Um, and I think in my head it was going to be plain sailing. You know, I was going to go to my first audition, and naturally they would cast me as, you know, Ophelia, and that would be it. And I went to audition after audition after audition and just didn't get anything. And occasionally I would get called back and offered a much, much smaller part, or a part I didn't really want to do. And I was getting really frustrated. And then at the same time, my brother and I were starting to write some comedy stuff together.
Mhm.
So my friend was then running the St Hugh's Drama Society, and they had a small budget which nobody ever used, because St Hugh's is where it is,
Mhm.
and because it was a women's college at the time. Nobody ever thought to go to St Hugh's and say, can we have some money to put towards our Trinity Garden production or whatever? No one ever did. So there was this budget that was just sitting there. So my friend Sarah said, well, look, why don't you just put on a show? Let's do the show right here, as they used to say in the old Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland films. So that's what we did. My brother and I wrote a show, and we did it in St Hugh's, and then we took it to Edinburgh, and it got seen in Edinburgh by the Oxford Review people, and they then came up to us and asked my brother to do some writing, and asked me to be in it and to write some songs. And so that's how I got involved with it.
And that was at the Fringe.
Yeah, the Edinburgh Fringe.
Yeah, I probably came and watched you at that stage. I was
Oh
just
my
in
goodness.
Edinburgh myself the first time when I was 21. I just started my apprenticeship as a lawyer in Edinburgh.
Right.
So the Fringe was a big thing for me then. So
Yeah.
little did I know, if I did see you, what was going to happen with you. Jeremy, your brother, you mentioned you've had a number of joint enterprises with Jeremy as well. He didn't study here, but I think he met someone here who was rather special.
Yes, he used to come up and visit me at St Hugh's a lot. My brother, he went to art school, in fact, in London. And he'd graduated. He's a few years older than me. So he graduated, he was doing odd jobs around in London, and he was starting out as a writer. And he'd come up to visit me a lot. And after a while, he rented a room in North Oxford. And I remember thinking, well, that's nice. You know, it's lovely. But I was slightly surprised.
Mm-hmm.
And I was the last to know that, in fact, he was going out with one of my very closest friends from St Hugh's, Kate O'Brien, who he later married. So Kate's now my sister-in-law, and there's a sort of nice St Hugh's, you know,
Absolutely.
alumni
In the family, and great taste going out for St Hugh's. Your acting career, from being the first woman president of the Review, which in itself is a historic achievement, how well were you treated in that role, and what was it like for women in acting, even at that seedling stage?
Well, the previous, the person who ran the Oxford Review prior to my taking it over was a guy called Max Henderson Begg. He wasn't actually the president, but he was the secretary, I think. But he was one of these people who, he could have been running a multinational corporation when he was 19. Mm-hmm. And so I still don't really have any interest at all in things like production and production management. And, you know, so I would never have put myself up for being the president of the Oxford Review, because I had absolutely no interest in it. Mm-hmm. But Max kind of I suddenly was. Max sort of handed it to me, and yeah. I never quite understood how it had happened. It just, one day I wasn't the president of the Oxford Review, and then the next day I apparently was. Mm-hmm. So it was quite a steep learning curve. But I do remember Max he was obviously a bit of a sort of proto-feminist, because I remember saying to him, I wasn't going to do this. So how do I do this whole being a president? And he just sort of went, oh, it's fine. You know, just look, here are the notes. And there was incredibly detailed notes. You just do that. Okay. So I did it. And it wasn't a particularly taxing role, if I'm honest. So it was nice to have that sort of honorific of thinking, well, it's always been a male dominated thing. And actually here I am doing it. And in fact, following me was another female president. So it became much more of a women's thing.
Mhm.
But in my memory, the Oxford Review was not particularly sexist. A lot of comedy at that time was. I mean, an
Yes.
awful lot of comedy was still kind of men dressing as women and getting laughs out of that. And of course, Monty Python did that brilliantly, but nonetheless, it is, you know, it's not something we would particularly want to be doing today. But the Oxford Review that I came into was pretty evenly balanced. I mean, I suppose there were 4 men and 2 women, so it's not that even. But I don't remember ever thinking, oh my goodness, if they give me another straight part, I'm going to have to walk out of here. I mean, it was always, we were given the jokes, and that was probably helped by the fact that my brother was writing a lot of material, and he's brilliant at writing for women. I was writing the songs, and so I'd write lots of songs for the women to do. So it always felt like we had a fair crack of the whip.
Mhm. Did that continue then when you left university and you launched your acting career?
It did. I mean, I quite quickly realised that it was obviously predominantly a man's world.
Mhm.
And so most of the productions I got into in radio or TV or anything, I was the only woman. And gradually they might allow there to be 2 women, you know, if we were very lucky.
Mhm.
But I was incredibly fortunate. I mean, I think as time goes on and the Me Too movement becomes much more public and so on, I increasingly think I really was unbelievably fortunate with the people I worked with.
Mhm.
Because I got involved working with Armando Iannucci very, very early on. He was one of the first producers that I started working with. And Armando could not be more sort of even-handed and fair and decent and lovely. He's just an incredibly nice, good person.
And a Glaswegian.
And a Glaswegian, naturally, that's why I mentioned it. So he sort of steered me through a lot of my career. And in fact, at the same time as starting to work with him, I did my first telly project, which was a children's project with a guy named Michael Forte, who went on to run children's television for ITV, I think, at one stage. And again, you know, I knew nothing about television. I was the only woman in this thing. And Mike just went out of his way to teach me camera technique, to make sure that I always had jokes, I always had funny characters. He'd write me monologues to do. So I was really, really lucky with it was a male-dominated world, but the men I worked with happened to be really good people.
Enlightened. And Armando and you had several collaborations in drama and comedy, and some of them were obviously hugely successful. And I think the thick of it is clearly a fabulous one and a BAFTA winning one, both for yourself and for the series itself. But also there was a day-to-day, as I understand it, and Knowing Me, Knowing You, as I mentioned earlier with Alan Partridge, and then the Avenue 5 that we mentioned as well about this. It's hilarious. I watched the Hugh Laurie and the cruise the cruise to Mars that goes badly off the scale and the route rather, and thereafter you take over. And fabulous character, and your outfits and for it were absolutely amazing.
It's a dream to play. Yeah.
So what was it like then to work with Armando Iannucci? You mentioned how enlightened he was in the actual production, and for instance, in the thick of it, it just seems such a dynamic, fast-moving, witty show that the whole beat of it seems to be quite frantic at times. And did it appear like that when you were in the programme?
Yes, it did actually. I mean, I think I look back on it with nothing but affection, because it was absolutely the most fun job to do. It was brilliant. As I have to say, it almost always is working with Armando. It just is always huge fun. But certainly with the thick of it, the nature of the way it was written, because there are rewrites coming in thick and fast all the time, and that still happens on Avenue 5, but it was very marked on thick of it that, you know, things would be rewritten, and you know, it was very frenetic. So it was very high pressure. It wasn't a relaxing job to do, but I just rarely had more fun on a job. It was brilliant. Everybody in the cast and all the writers and everybody are such nice people. It was a really brilliant atmosphere on set. We all just laughed, you know, even more offset than we did when we were doing the material. So yeah, he's a great person to work with, and he encourages everybody to improvise as much as possible and to keep things fresh. And that's very empowering for actors, of course, because you're sort of being, sometimes acting can be slightly infantilizing. And acting with Armando is always very invigorating because he expects you to be using your brain. You're not just, you know, I've heard actors describing themselves as meat props. You're not just sort of a lump of meat who's being put in front of a camera and told to do those lines. When you're with Armando, you really are expected to kind of think on your feet and be in character the whole time and do unexpected stuff. And it's brilliant fun.
I think you wrote at one stage, occasionally he would throw a line in, an unexpected line, or prompt an actor to say a line that was totally unexpected, just to get your own reaction.
Yeah.
And your reaction, and to see how that would work.
Yeah. He loves playing little tricks. I remember him, I was doing a scene with Chris Addison, who played my spad, my assistant. And I leave the room, and Chris Addison at that point did an impression. I think he improvised an impression of me playing Nicola Murray, which was, you know, needless to say, not very flattering. And I was meant to have left the scene, and Armando just went, go back in, and ask him what, because I didn't know what he'd done. And he said, go back in and say, I hear you've been doing an impression of me. And I went in, and Chris just looked absolutely terrified. And I said, so I hear you're doing impressions of me around the office. And it totally floored him. It was brilliant. And his response was so natural. And it just, those kind of things just really make everything spiky and fizzy and exciting to watch, I think.
And the part you had was brilliant, and you portrayed it brilliantly, if I may say so as well, of Nicola Murray. Having been a minister myself in the Scottish context, where I'm very pleased not to be at the moment, I should add, that it really did represent some of the sort of high octane, you know, improvisation and thought that has to go on in that context. Did you meet any government ministers beforehand, or did you have any role models? That's not the most entirely flattering role model to have, so you might even say, yes, I did. But you're thinking of someone in particular when you were portraying
I mean, she's not based on any government minister. In fact, what Armando said when we first started talking about her, he was asking about my interest in politics, and I said, actually, when I was in the sixth form at school, I had genuinely briefly thought about going into politics. So Armando said, what kind of politician would you have been? And that was the key to Nicola. It was because I said, oh, I would have been awful. And that's so basically Nicola is the politician I would have been, I'm afraid to say. Not necessarily in terms of her party politics, but just useless and easily led and and panicky. But what I did have a couple of really brilliant, useful meetings, research meetings with people. One was with a recently, she had been a female cabinet minister, and then she stood down at that stage. But she was fantastic. I didn't know her at all, but somebody put me in touch with her, and she gave me lots of her time and came up with all these brilliant things. Like there's a detail with Nicola Murray that she always changes into trainers when she gets into the office, because the rest of the time she's in these teetering high heels. So she's always walking around the office with sort of one shoe on and one shoe off. And that was from this woman who said, oh God, yeah, you've always got to have your trainers in a bag, because you cannot get through a day otherwise. And the other one was this really chilling piece of advice, which was I had a lunch with a guy who was a sort of informal spin doctor, kind of Malcolm Tucker, but not Alistair Campbell or somebody, you know, but someone who worked in spin for the government. And I had lunch with him, and at the end of the lunch, I said, what would make this character a real nightmare for somebody like you, for Malcolm Tucker, in other words? And he was sort of gathering his stuff together at the end of the lunch, and he honestly didn't even think about this. He just sort of went, oh, you know, if she believed in stuff. Oh my goodness, that's so cynical and awful. And immediately got on the phone to Armando and said, okay, I think she has to believe in stuff. It's just a nightmare.
And you know, that is such a fabulous role, which you portrayed brilliantly, and I think so many people love it and watch it constantly. It must be probably one of the most watched still of comedy series, particularly to cheer you up in the context of this dreadful pandemic we've got. But what was it for you, your favourite role of Iannucci's dramas, or was there any other that came close to or surpassed?
I think it probably was. I mean, it's still one of my favorite jobs ever because of all those things. Of, you know, I made such good friends on it, and she was just so much fun to play. And it's actually, I've always played characters who are very unlike me, or almost always. That's kind of what I went into acting to do. So to play someone who actually was quite like me, but was really like the most rubbish version of me, was there's something quite cathartic about that, just seeing how dreadful I am capable of being. So I really enjoyed that. Although I have to say, in Armando terms, the character I'm playing now on Avenue 5 is enormous fun, because that takes me back into the realm of playing characters who are totally unlike me. And she's a Karen. She's called Karen, and she's a sort of very entitled American broad who knows her rights, and she wants to speak to the manager, and she's got this incredible sort of Kris Jenner, you know, quiff and amazing shoulder pads. And that's been huge fun to play a character like that who is so not like me at all.
Did you have any say in the design of your fabulous outfits? I mean, they're just outrageous, how fabulous.
Yeah, no, the design, the whole design team, actually, you know, clothes, makeup, you know, the physical design of the spaceship are incredibly talented, all of them, but also incredibly sort of clubbable. They're real team players. So they absolutely have been, you know, from the very beginning. I was going to fittings and they were listening very carefully to what I was saying, you know, and if I said, oh, I think she's the kind of woman who would do that, then they'd make sure that my wig was something I could do. Well, you know, they were really just immensely helpful. So my phone, in fact, is Susie Harmon is the costume designer. And there's a whole text thread on my phone between me and her, which is basically Instagram pictures of Kris Jenner in elaborate designer outfits, with, you know, me sort of sending a picture and then Susie going, I'll see if they've got it on sale in Harrods. It's enormous fun.
Oh, well, you can't go over the top for a cruise to Mars. Where can you dress up for?
Absolutely.
No, it's absolutely amazing. Apart from your comic acting, which has been prolific, you're also very, very well known for your serious drama, and there's been so much of that. And just to remind folk out there about who most of them will be very familiar with it, in the wonderful series Lewis, the successor to the earlier series, you were Chief Superintendent Jean Innocent for a number of years there, and formidable. Mrs. Bennett in Death Comes to Pemberley, Mrs. Landau in The Eichmann Show, Vera in Humans, Princess Anna in War and Peace, and also Alice in Queers, and Lady Whitworth in Poldark for me. And that was a pretty odd character you played in Poldark. Was that quite fun? It looked great fun, you know, to watch as well, because she was just so gruesome.
Oh, she was vile. I mean, she normally I mean, people, obviously actors approach roles in different ways, but I always try, if I can, to approach a character kind of, you know, quite small and from the inside, and try and figure out what makes them tick. And my two sort of mantras are, one is no human being, I think, ever really truly thinks they're an awful person. They'll justify it to themselves. And the other thing is, I'm always interested in levels of tension. What level of anxiety and tension is my character at any given point? And some characters are completely relaxed and completely chilled, and that's useful as well. So I always try and think in terms of, you know, how stressed they are and how uptight, and also how do they justify their behavior. And obviously, if you're playing a character like Lady Whitworth in Poldark, who is sort of irredeemably awful to modern sensibilities, she's dreadful. That was a bit of a challenge, because she actually, I think they allowed me one half smile at my very final scene. I seem to remember I was allowed, my grandson comes towards me and I'm allowed to just go, and that was it. But the rest of the time she is hatchet-faced and vile. And it was really interesting trying to get into her head. And I was playing the mother of Christian Brassington, who plays this sort of evil vicar in Poldark. And Christian really was my way into the character, because Christian had totally come to terms with how dreadful his character was. And so we just talked about what family life for the Whitworths would have been. And that was really helpful. It gave us the opportunity to sort of work our way through the psyche, to do a quick deep dive into the psychology of the Whitworths.
Oh, she was a very useful role model for a principal of St Hugh's College when I was kind of under
I
carefully.
like to think that's what you're like. Yes, there's a wig hanging around somewhere. I mean, you can borrow it if you ever need to.
Do with
For that extra height and gravitas.
it. Of those television dramas that I've described there, what was the most memorable one for you? Those where it was serious as opposed to a comic or comedian acting.
It's tricky. I mean, it's sort of, it depends kind of which aspect of it I'm looking back on. But one of the ones I'm most proud of, I think, is the Eichmann show, which you just mentioned, which actually was recently repeated on BBC, I think. Which is it's actually a very, very small part. I think I was in 3 scenes or something. And it was a film that I hadn't worked with the director before. I didn't really know very much about it. And it happened that I filmed it in Lithuania, and I was only actually there for about 36 hours because it happened to just coincide with my mother had an operation, and she was fine, but it actually didn't seem to be fine. And so there was a whole lot of stuff going on in my personal life, which meant that I literally flew out, did this thing, my head was all over the place, and then flew home again. So it was one of those ones. I'm playing a character, again, slightly cold hotel owner in Jerusalem. And the film is about the televising of the trial of Eichmann, and how that was the first moment at which many, many people in Israel realized that the Holocaust was true. And so Jewish residents in Israel who hadn't themselves been, in Europe at the time of the Holocaust, it was so unthinkable that they simply didn't believe it. And my character, and I think my dialogue was based on testimony, goes up to the filmmaker one morning at breakfast because he's staying in her hotel, and she says to him, "This is the first time people have believed me. When I first came here from Germany, I said what had happened, and they said, you're lying, you're making it up. Why don't you just go to Hollywood and make it into a film, because it's not true. So thanks to you, people now believe me." And it was a tiny thing, but it was so incredibly moving. And I think from an acting point of view, because I had a lot of other stuff going on in my head, that was really helpful, because it meant that I was having to put a lid on that. And that was what Mrs. Landau had been doing for the past 20 years. She'd been keeping a lid on this dreadful, dreadful thing that she'd been through.
But to get that affirmation as well is tremendous, as well, and something so profound.
Mm.
You've also featured in a number of feature films in the cinema, and the astronauts down a dark hall, very sinister indeed, Transformers, The Last Night, and
That was a laugh.
Session with Uma Thurman, as we mentioned. And I think in that, again, you play a Scottish woman in this psychiatric, I think it's a clinic. It seems almost like a very sinister, dark house, and it's based in Aberdeen, where I worked for a number of years. And it was, constantly gloomy and with very dark scenes around the whole. I sat on the edge of my seat throughout the whole film. I really found it.
Well, I haven't seen it myself yet.
It's well worth watching, I can assure you, if you've got nerves of steel. But where did you learn your Scottish accent from? Was it from Armando and Peter, or someone else?
Probably a bit of that. I mean, I am a bit of a sponge. I will absorb people's accents. One of my closest friends is Welsh, and we used to be in a double act together, and we spent a lot of time touring together. And I would find quite often that by the end of a day, I'd slipped into a Welsh accent just because because I'm listening to it the whole time. So yeah, I've obviously spent a lot of time with Peter Capaldi and Armando Iannucci and listening to that. And I really do. I'm not just saying this, Eilish. I genuinely do love that accent. So yeah, I think it's just, I find with accents, as I do actually with almost everything in acting, that the less I think about it, the better it is, weirdly. It's much better to try and keep it instinctive. So if I overthink an accent, I don't really like working with vocal coaches if I can avoid it, because I get a bit too finicky and precise, and I don't really want to do that. I'd rather just get the impression of an accent. And that one, I said to you when we were speaking earlier, I was incredibly nervous about it, because I did think, there's going to be an awful lot of Scottish people watching this thinking, why did they pick her? But it's such a lovely accent, and I was very happy just to kind of listen to lots of Scottish people and absorb it.
Great. Well, as well as film, you've done so much radio work and radio drama in particular and comedy. And I listened to Incredible Woman, which was written by Jeremy, your brother. And in fact, he appeared with you on that as well. And it was just an absolute delight to go from one 14-minute episode to the next. When you're chatting along in the car, listening to this and laughing, and is radio a completely different experience in terms of acting? How do you, as a medium of entertainment, how do you find that more generally?
I think I'm rarely more relaxed than when I'm in a radio studio, because I started out in radio. In fact, I met my husband working in radio. I've been doing radio since I left St Hugh's pretty well consistently. So there is something amazing about walking into a radio studio, because of course I'm really relaxed in a TV studio, but you're always having to remember the lines, and there's sort of makeup to think about and checks and costume checks and everything. With radio, there's none of that at all. You've got your script in front of you, and it's like the kind of essence of everything that actors love about acting, which is that you're playing a part, you're showing off, you're making your mates laugh, and in between times, because you don't have to remember your lines or anything, you can just sit and tell anecdotes. It's just heaven. So if you take all of that and then wrap it up with I'm doing my brother's scripts and I'm working with my brother, it's just it is honestly so much fun.
Great delight. You also wrote the radio play Shush as well, and I remember seeing you also playing York at one point.
Yes,
that, which was hilarious. Again, do you enjoy the writing side of it as much as the acting, or is it?
I don't really know, and in fact, when Incredible Women first started, I co-wrote it, the first couple of series with Jeremy, and then when Shush came along, which by the way nobody knows, I don't know how many people have listened to Shush, which was a Radio 4 sitcom set in a library, but what most people don't know, because it's basically a cartoon, it's incredibly big and broad and silly, it was actually originally an Armando Iannucci production. Armando set the whole thing up, got me and Morwenna Banks together and developed it with us, and then he moved on to doing Veep, so obviously he didn't have time to do it, so we did it on radio, not with him, with David Tyler. But anyway, so at one stage I was writing Incredible Women with Jeremy, and then I was writing Shush with Morwenna, and I think it was around the time I started to get quite busy. I was doing War and Peace, so I was going backwards and forwards a lot to Lithuania and St Petersburg and filming other stuff, and I just thought, actually this bit I really love, the bit where I get to be in the studio with Jeremy or with Morwenna, and the bit when I get to be in front of the camera with Paul Dano and James Norton. Those bits I love. And the only bit I'm kind of thinking about is the bit where I have to open my laptop and do a pass on a script, because Jeremy's done a rewrite and I need to have a look at it and tell him what I think. And after a while I just got in touch with both of them and said, I don't think I'm bringing enough to it. I think they're both such brilliant writers, they don't need me. And actually it wasn't giving me any joy. So I just said, I'd really like to carry on doing it, but I just don't want to do the writing.
I have to say, in the televised version of it, I thought you were fabulous as a hysterical librarian.
Very neurotic. She's another one who's quite a lot like me, I have to say. She's
I've always been slightly librarians. It's probably a guilty conscience, that's projected that. I've probably got some books still from the university's law school somewhere tucked away. But,
I have to say, actually, just as a sidebar, the character, in case anybody out there has listened to Shush, the library sitcom, I play a character called Alice, who was a child protege, who went to Oxford at the age of, I think she's supposed to have gone at the age of 7 or something like that. But it's no coincidence that I was at St Hugh's at the same time as Ruth Lawrence. So that's one little St Hugh's element. But the other thing is that Alice is consequently meant to be, she's very uptight and she's very donnish in that sort of old school way. And she's an agoraphobic, so she hasn't really gone out of the house very much. So she just listens to music and reads books. And when we were trying to find a voice for her, I was thinking a lot about the greatly missed Anne Wordsworth, who taught English when I was there, and who was terrifying, but utterly, utterly brilliant. She was just an extraordinary tutor and really opened my eyes to different ways of looking at literature. She was an amazing woman, but she was terrifying. And so Alice's voice in Shush is basically my impression of Anne Wordsworth.
Oh, wonderful.
In case there's a little sort of slightly arcane bit of detail, in case anybody of my age would remember that.
Yeah. You've also, in fact, it's exhausting reading your CV, essentially, you know, that is here. But the books that you've written and found the time to write, the autobiographical, but your power of observation, you talk about that being a critical part of how you have built your career as an actress, but also as a writer. That you're like a sponge, and that if you're in any public place, you're listening and watching people. It's something you love, and you inherited that from your father as well. That observation, and it's just wonderful fun to read through that, seeing the evidence of that process in your life as well. It did make me slightly concerned about ever sitting next to you in a cafe, because knowing that you would be shopping closely. But it is such a great thing, and I've noticed that the opportunity to do that has been reduced very much by dint of technology. Everybody's on a computer or on their telephone, and usually with something plugged in. So even if you hear one part of the conversation, you don't hear the other part. So it leads to speculation. But most people are doing that where nobody looks out of the windows and no one is really chatting in the way that they had before. So I'm wondering if you're now feeling very deprived, of your material because of this advent of our compulsion with technology.
Funnily enough, I think in some ways it's made it easier, because everybody's on their phones. Nobody notices. You know, when everybody was kind of sitting on the top deck of a bus looking around,
Yes.
it's quite hard then to be watching somebody and listening to them. But if that person is actually on their phone, and some people are immensely generous with their conversations on the phone, you'll notice they really do like to share. So that's great for people like me. That's fantastic. So I generally don't, although I do have those little things that go in your ears, and I can never, are they supposed to be earbuds? Are they earpod? I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, I've got those, but I very rarely use them, or if I do, I quite often have one out, and I am earwigging a lot of the time. And now actually it's funny, because my daughter used to slightly resent it. I think my son always kind of got it, understood, and was also quite interested. My daughter did used to slightly resent it, and sometimes we'd be in a restaurant, and to my great shame, she would suddenly go, "You're doing it, aren't you, Mum?" And I'd think, "Oh, I am doing it. I'm really sorry, I wasn't listening." But now she does it as well. She's every bit as nosy as I am.
Oh yeah. Why else go to a restaurant?
Get a takeaway, right? If you just want to talk amongst yourselves.
People watching. But congratulations as well in the book, because I know you were shortlisted for the National Book Awards Non-Fiction Book of the Year for Curious, and just tremendous, a great achievement as well. And I hope you continue to write, because it's just wonderful fun.
My literary agent hopes that as well. At the moment, every now and then I get little sort of, nervous emails saying, "Any thoughts at all?" And I go, "No, I'm quite lazy actually." And so at the moment I have no great desire to write, but I might do it. Something might just sort of spark something off again.
Oh, well, I very much hope so. And we've talked about your professional career, and it's been so varied and so rich and so successful, and enormously proud of what you've achieved in that. And I'm sure all of those who are listening are thrilled to have your success, and we love to bathe in your reflected glory here at St Hugh's. But what is especially important is the work that you've also done on a voluntary basis regarding mental health. And we have a lot of students listening tonight, and we have a lot of students who going through this period of COVID, as well as the pressures, I think, that come in this 21st century in further education. When I speak to alumni and I speak to the current group of students, they don't have a recollection of it being as intense as it appears to be now. And I think certainly the workload seems to have been accelerated, and there are other pressures such as university fees that have to be paid, and the concern about jobs at the end of it. But your work for mental health has been tremendous, and you've worked, I should say, as a patron of Anxiety UK and an ambassador for Together for Short Lives, but you've also been very open about your own struggle with mental health, insofar as your claustrophobia and manifestation of anxiety. is there any advice that you could give to our students, indeed to all of us just now who are struggling in the current environment, about how to deal with some of the manifestations of anxiety or other aspects of depression, etc., that may be affecting their lives?
I think that the most important advice is about talking to people. Now, the problem, part of the problem that we have is that for many, many years, mental health hasn't been on a par with physical health. And so there is a lot of help available on the NHS, and obviously there's a lot of help available privately if you can pay for it. But it takes a long time to access help for mental health. And I've heard from lots and lots of people who've said, well, that's all very well and good saying, get CBT or something, but I'm going to have to wait 9 months. And I myself have been in a situation where I've been having panic attacks to such a severe degree and over a prolonged period of time that I've actually thought I couldn't wait an hour, let alone 9 months before getting an appointment. But one of the great advantages of the age we live in is that even if you can't get an appointment for 9 months or something, and I think that successive governments have tried to increase funding so that those waiting times hopefully will start to come down. There is an enormous amount of help available online. So you can go to Anxiety UK, have a website for panic and anxiety disorder. Mind, of course, there are a whole load of mental health charities. And if you just go to a search engine and put in panic attacks, a load of information will come up. And that would be my biggest advice, is don't suffer in silence, because I think that for my parents' generation, having mental health issues was embarrassing, was seen as shameful, or something that you just didn't talk about. For my generation, people, I think, are willing to get help and are willing to talk about it, but it's still seen as a little bit kind of self-indulgent, a bit kind of Woody Allen-y. Nobody wants to think about being in therapy for years, and I don't quite know why not. But I think for this next generation, for my children's generation and the students at St Hugh's now, they are much more open and much more willing to talk about stuff. But the annoying thing is that they're being kind of criticized for that. They're being told that they're snowflakes, and they're being told that they're sort of weak in some way, and they're too sensitive. And just screen that out. Just screen all that out. If everybody has problems, and if you have a problem, you need to get some help with it, and you need to talk to your friends or your family or to a professional, and you need to go online and get some help. And do not listen to the haters who will tell you that that's in some way a weakness, because honestly, getting help for a problem like that is nothing but a sign of strength.
Thank you very much indeed. I have some questions, Rebecca, from our alumni. I've incorporated some of them into my own questions there, so I hope those of you who submitted them, and I'm very grateful to you all. We're not going to probably have enough time to get through them all, but if I can ask, you can have a go at some of them as well. And I'm very grateful to you all for, as I say, submitting them to us. So one of our listeners has asked, is there another St Hugh's alumna who inspires you?
There are a number of rather extraordinary alumna, but I think for me it would be Emily Wilding Davison, who the suffragette who famously the kind of one of the few suffragettes everybody's heard of, because she was the woman who died at the Epsom Derby under the King's horse. And there's a lot of doubt as to whether she committed suicide or whether she was trying to pin a WSPU flag on the horse, or what she was trying to do. But when I was growing up, I was immensely influenced by the suffragettes. I was really, as I think all women should be, I first heard about it because there was a drama on the BBC about the suffragettes and about the Pankhursts. And I got kind of really into it when I was probably about 9 or 10. And I remember reading up lots and lots of stuff about all the suffragettes, including Emily Wilding Davison, who really had the worst of it. She was force-fed, and just everything dreadful that could happen happened to her. She sounds to me like an intensely brave and extraordinary woman. And so when I found out she was at St Hugh's, I really did feel this kind of amazing flush of pride.
We now have an Emily Wilding Davison room in the college.
Really?
It's the small SCR, which is close to the dining hall, and we have newspaper cuttings. We have a portrait of her,
Wow.
and various other memorabilia from that period, as well as the suffragettes banner.
Brilliant. That wasn't there when I was there. I would have remembered.
Well, Senja Peseta, our professor in modern history, she commissioned a reproduction of the banner that was carried by St Hugh's suffragettes and suffragists at the major parade that took place up Banbury Road of all the Oxford College women. And so we reproduced it for the commemoration of the 1918 and 1919 centenaries as well. So they're there. So all of you are very welcome to come and see. It's lovely to see her, apart from the rest of the college, which is also lovely. I'm also asked to ask you, what do you think you have carried from your English studies that most affected or helped you in your acting career?
Oh gosh, that's a really interesting one. I mean, I think the ability to get inside a text is immensely valuable as an actor.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a strange thing because I referenced earlier that I like to think in terms of being very kind of, I like to work on impulse. I like to not think too much. I don't like to intellectualize when I'm acting. So whereas a lot of actors will take a script and will do quite a sort of detailed textual analysis on it before they start developing the character. And that's a totally valid way of working. I absolutely don't do that. Because I think I would find it would hamper me too much. So I like to work on the character and think about who she might be and how she sounds and how stressed she is and all those other things that I mentioned to you earlier and how she justifies the way she behaves. But then once you've done all of that, actually then you do have to really work on the text. And so the ability to, the fact that I had to work on texts, to do 2 essays a week for eight weeks a term or whatever it was at the time, is really good, because it means I can slip very quickly into reading a text and getting quite a good sort of measure of it very quickly. So I think it's been very useful from that point of view.
I also asked to ask you, were any elements of your many and varied roles, such as Jean Innocent, Nicola Murray and Helen Bute, modelled or inspired by people you met in Oxford during your time at St Hugh's?
No, they weren't really. I mean, I think as I mentioned earlier, I did used to do this. I used to do my Anne voice. And at the time I used to do an Avril Bruton voice as well, which sadly I can no longer do. So when I first started doing sketch comedy, which is kind of how I first began, those voices were very useful because they were two quite extreme, very different characters. And I did a couple of sort of sketch characters, I think, that were loosely based on them. Mm-hmm. But no, actually, they haven't been really. And also I tend to, most of the characters I play are an amalgam of lots and lots of different. So there might be an element of one person, or a laugh from one person and a walk from another person and a flick of the hair from another one. But it would rarely just be one character who you just kind of lift wholesale.
Mm. And then we're asked, how do you think the perception of women in comedy has changed over the years?
Oh gosh, I mean, it's changed massively, and for the better, I think. When I was growing up, there were brilliant women working in comedy, and I mean, I was, like Victoria Wood was a few years older than me, Julie Walters and people like that. So they were the people I was looking up to. But when I was younger than that, when I first started to get into watching kind of Ealing comedies and those sort of things, there were always brilliant women. There were always fantastic character comedy actresses, but somehow, I don't know, they rarely led a thing. They rarely, the weight of the project was rarely put on their shoulders. And that has changed, and there's still not enough change, but it's getting much better. It's, I get slightly depressed occasionally when I think about, there is so much fuss made around a project that's predominantly female, because you kind of think, but there have been, for every one Fleabag, there have been 50 other projects at least that are predominantly male. And I think everybody should be talking about Fleabag, but nobody is talking about the male projects as being revolutionary because they're male. So I would kind of really like it to just be something that we don't notice, that just you know, and the same with diversity, the same with ethnic diversity. It should, ideally, you should get to that point where it's just something you don't notice, but you don't get to that without an awful lot of kind of leaning on and crowbarring in and creating and making space. And that's where we are at the moment. Now with women in comedy, I think we're well on the way to that. I think with ethnic diversity, we're not well on the way. We're starting out, and we've still got a long way to go.
And I'm also asked, and I think this is a student who's asking this, how did you go about getting acting representation after you graduated?
I did a postgraduate year at what was Webber Douglas, which has now been subsumed into Central. I think it's now part of Central School of Speech and Drama. I think quite a few acting schools will still do postgraduate courses, but of course, for your generation, you're now looking at more fees, which I wasn't. I had a grant for my degree, and actually I got a discretionary grant to go to drama school. So I was from that lucky generation. But that was very helpful, going to drama school and just doing 1 year, and then agents came to see projects that I was doing and so on. I don't think it's the only way in. And what we didn't have then, and what you do have now, certainly in comedy terms, is YouTube. So you can come up with a character and you can try and gain a bit of traction on YouTube doing that character. And actually, you know, the work will come to you, I think. I mean, I make it sound very easy, but people will notice you and you can get work out of that. So that's one way of doing it. Otherwise, I think you probably just have to kind of email people. Everybody's supposed to try and get a show reel together if you can do that. Get into student plays, get into fringe productions, do some YouTube, get a show reel together, and approach agents that way.
Well, I think that's very helpful. And then finally, I'm sure you'll be exhausted having been interrogated. Your performance, this is from one of our listeners. Your performance in Nighty Night is pure gold, and the energy between the characters is fantastic. Are there any plans to get the cast back together for a new collaboration, or perhaps brackets, dare we dream, a reunion series with Kath, Dawn, Jill and Glenn?
I have to say, I would kind of really enjoy doing that, actually. I spoke to Julia not all that long ago. We had a brief catch up, and I said that I get asked this frequently, more than about any other project, actually. I quite often get people coming up to me in the street and saying, will you do another series? And I said to Julia, I'm guessing it's a no. And she said, I don't think so. So I don't think it's going to happen. But I don't know, never say never. It was so much fun to work on. And I saw Mark Gatiss recently, who is just an incredibly lovely person. So I'd be there like a shot, but I don't know. I wouldn't hold your breath.
I'm sure there are other wonderful things in the wings and waiting for us as well. Rebecca, thank you so much for participating in this. It's been great fun having this conversation with you tonight. I'm sure people out there also appreciate you giving us your time and your history and memory of your time here at the college and your career. And can I just say how much we look forward to you coming back to college and joining us here, and I'm sure some of our audience out there would love to come and actually get to meet you in the flesh and have an opportunity to hear from you again.
I'd love that. Yes, please.
Many thanks indeed. And to all of our audience out there, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you all and your families keep very well. Many thanks to all of you who have been supporting the college also through what has been a very harsh time for the college as well. We're very grateful to you, as are our students who have been really well supported by you. And please take care of all of your family and yourself, and have a great Easter holiday for those who are celebrating it. Good night. Good night, Rebecca. Thank you
so much. Thank you.